Have you ever noticed that there's a certain group of people who can remember the sound of a dial-up modem and the feeling of rewinding a cassette with a pencil, but also manage cloud storage, group chats, and streaming subscriptions without blinking? They didn't grow up documenting their lives online, yet they adapted to doing exactly that as adults. They're comfortable with technology, but not defined by it. Independent, but not quite as skeptical as Gen X. Adaptable, but often more cautious than millennials. If you belong to this group, you've probably spent years being told you're one thing or the other. Too young to be Gen X, too old to be a millennial. Pick a side, right? But psychologically, you were never meant to fit neatly into either. You are what researchers and cultural psychologists sometimes call a microgeneration. Xennials. Born roughly between 1976 and 1985. A tiny slice of time that happened to sit directly on one of the biggest cultural fault lines in modern history. The shift from an analog world to a digital one. And that timing didn't just shape your habits. It shaped how your brain learned to adapt, trust, communicate, and even define identity. Because here's the thing about human development that often gets overlooked. Your personality isn't formed in a vacuum. It's built through repeated interactions with the environment you grow up in, the tools you use, the speed of change around you, the expectations placed on you before your brain has finished wiring itself. And if you were a Xennial, your developmental environment didn't just change. It transformed midstream. Imagine learning to write by hand before ever touching a keyboard. Imagine doing school research by physically walking to a library, flipping through card catalogs, and hoping the book you needed wasn't already checked out. Now imagine, just a few years later, being told that information was suddenly instant, searchable, infinite, and that you needed to learn this new system fast because the world was moving on without hesitation. That kind of transition does something fascinating to the brain. Neuroscience tells us that during childhood and adolescence, the brain is especially sensitive to patterns of problem solving. It builds neural pathways based on how effort leads to reward. If you grew up in a slower, analog environment, your brain learned patience, sequencing, and delayed gratification. You had to wait for things, figure them out step by step, tolerate not knowing. But then, just as those pathways were stabilizing, the environment flipped. Suddenly speed mattered. Flexibility mattered. Learning new systems mattered more than mastering one. So instead of reinforcing a single cognitive style, Xennials developed what psychologists might call dual processing habits. You learned to think both linearly and adaptively. To tolerate ambiguity, then pivot quickly. To plan, and to improvise. That's why many Xennials feel strangely comfortable during periods of uncertainty. Not because uncertainty is pleasant, but because their brains were trained in it. You didn't grow up with constant upgrades. You grew up during the upgrade. And that experience often creates a subtle psychological trait, adaptive skepticism. You tend to believe in change because you've seen it firsthand. But you don't automatically trust it. You want to see how it works. Test it. Maybe complain about it a little first. It's not resistance. It's calibration. Another defining feature of the Xennial experience is what sociologists sometimes call transitional independence. As children, many Xennials had relatively unstructured time. You played outside without GPS tracking. You negotiated friendships face-to-face. You solved boredom creatively because there wasn't an algorithm waiting to entertain you. Yet, unlike earlier generations, you entered adulthood just as communication became constant. Email, texting, social media. Suddenly availability was expected, not optional. That contrast can create an internal tension many Xennials recognize, but rarely articulate. Part of you is deeply comfortable being unreachable. Another part knows modern life doesn't really allow that anymore. So you toggle. You answer messages. Then crave silence. You engage the digital world. Then retreat from it. Not because you dislike connection, but because your nervous system was shaped in a time when connection had natural pauses. Psychologists studying attention and emotional regulation often point out that the brain develops its baseline expectations early. If your formative years included long stretches of uninterrupted time, your brain still considers that state normal. The always-on culture that came later can feel like background noise you never fully adjusted to. That's why many Xennials describe themselves as both tech-capable and tech-fatigued. You can use the tools. You just don't want to live inside them. There's also an identity component here that's easy to miss. Millennials largely formed their sense of self alongside digital expression. Gen X largely formed theirs before it. Xennials did something more complicated. They built an identity privately first, then learned to translate it into public digital spaces later. That sequence matters. Developmental psychologists note that when identity forms before external validation systems appear, people tend to anchor their self-concept internally rather than socially. In other words, you're less likely to measure yourself by how visible you are, and more by whether your life feels coherent to you. You didn't grow up performing yourself. You grew up being yourself, and then were handed platforms that asked you to perform. No wonder it sometimes feels unnatural. This also helps explain why Xennials are often described as pragmatic rather than idealistic. You watched systems evolve in real time. You saw careers change shape, industries appear and disappear, and definitions of success constantly rewrite themselves. That kind of environment doesn't encourage rigid belief systems. It encourages flexibility with a hint of caution. You learn not to expect permanence. But you also learn not to panic when things changed. From a psychological resilience standpoint, that's a powerful combination. But it comes with trade-offs. Because living through continuous transition can make it harder to feel like you fully belong to any one narrative. You weren't rooted entirely in the old world. You didn't start entirely in the new one. You became translators, often without realizing that's what you were doing. And being a translator is cognitively demanding. You're constantly switching frameworks, explaining one mindset to another, remembering how things worked before while navigating how they work now. Over time, that can create a quiet sense of in-betweenness. Not lost, not confused, just perpetually adjusting. So the real psychology of Xennials isn't about nostalgia or technological trivia. It's about what happens when a generation's developmental years coincide with cultural acceleration. It's about how the brain learns stability in motion, identity in transition, and competence without a clear roadmap. You didn't inherit a finished world. You helped prototype the one we live in now. And that experience shaped far more than your playlists or your favorite childhood memories. It shaped how you handle uncertainty, how you trust change, and how you define yourself in a culture that keeps reinventing the rules. Next, we'll look at how this transitional wiring shows up in adulthood, especially in work, relationships, and the strangely complicated way Xennials think about success, security, and meaning. Now let's move into adulthood, because this is where the Xennial psychology becomes even more interesting. If your childhood was analog and your early adulthood was digital, then your career years unfolded during one of the fastest economic and technological pivots in history. You didn't just enter the workforce. You entered it while the rules were actively being rewritten. Think about that for a moment. You were told to get a degree because that's how stability worked. Then you watched industries destabilize. You were encouraged to be loyal to companies, but you also saw loyalty rewarded inconsistently. You learned email etiquette before instant messaging norms even existed. You adapted to social media not as teenagers experimenting, but as young professionals calculating. That kind of environment produces what psychologists might call strategic adaptability. You're not naive about institutions, but you're not entirely cynical either. You understand the system, but you don't romanticize it. You tend to approach work with a mindset that blends effort and hedging. Work hard, yes, but keep options open. Develop transferable skills. Stay competent enough to pivot if needed. If Gen X learned skepticism from watching corporate loyalty erode, and Millennials learned ambition in a world that encouraged personal branding, Xennials learned something slightly different. They learned contingency planning. There's a quiet mental spreadsheet running in the background. If this doesn't work, what's next? If this industry shifts, what can I move into? It's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. And here's where neuroscience becomes relevant again. The brain's stress system calibrates itself based on repeated experiences of unpredictability. If your formative years included watching rapid cultural and technological change, your stress response doesn't necessarily spike at novelty. Instead, it becomes alert but analytical. You don't panic at updates. You assess them. This shows up in leadership styles too. Many Xennials are now stepping into management roles, and they often bring a hybrid approach. They remember being micromanaged in rigid systems. They also remember chaotic early startup culture. So they tend to prefer structure with flexibility. Give people autonomy, but set expectations. Allow innovation, but don't abandon stability. It's a middle path, and it's not accidental. It's neurological conditioning shaped by living in two worlds. Let's talk about relationships, because this is where the emotional wiring of Xennials becomes even more layered. Remember that transitional independence we talked about earlier? Growing up with relatively unstructured time, forming friendships face-to-face, resolving conflict in person. That built certain relational muscles. Patience, reading body language, tolerating awkwardness without escape buttons. Then adulthood introduced digital immediacy. Text threads, read receipts, online dating, constant access to communication, but often less depth in it. So many Xennials find themselves craving depth while navigating platforms optimized for speed. You might notice this in yourself. You can maintain surface-level contact with dozens of people online, but what actually feels meaningful is a long, uninterrupted conversation. A phone call that stretches. A shared memory that doesn't need documentation. Psychologists studying socio-emotional selectivity theory suggest that as people mature, they naturally begin prioritizing emotionally meaningful interactions over expansive networks. But for Xennials, that shift can start earlier because the contrast between offline intimacy and online visibility is so stark. You remember connection without performance, and that memory shapes your expectations. This doesn't mean you reject modern forms of interaction. You use them, but you often hold them loosely. They're tools, not identity anchors. Another fascinating Xennial trait is their relationship with achievement. You grew up at a time when the narrative around success was shifting. The 1980s carried echoes of career-driven ambition. The 1990s introduced a growing conversation about personal fulfillment. By the 2000s, hustle culture began taking hold. So you absorbed multiple definitions of success before your identity solidified. That can create internal conflict. Part of you values stability. Another part values autonomy. Another part values meaning. And sometimes those values compete. Do I prioritize security or flexibility? Income or impact? Consistency or reinvention? Psychologically, this is what happens when a generation is socialized during overlapping value systems. Your brain doesn't have one dominant template for success. It has several. And while that can feel confusing at times, it's also an enormous cognitive asset. Because it means you can reevaluate without feeling like you're betraying your identity. You've already adapted before. Reinvention doesn't feel like failure. It feels like evolution. This also shows up in parenting for Xennials who have children. You likely grew up with more independence than the generation after you. You may have walked home alone, figured things out without constant adult oversight. At the same time, you entered adulthood during rising awareness around child safety and emotional validation. So you carry both instincts. Give them freedom, but stay emotionally available. It's a delicate balance, and it reflects something deeper. Xennials often aim to integrate rather than reject the past. You don't usually swing to extremes. You recalibrate. And that recalibration is tied to what psychologists call integrative complexity, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing into one. Growing up between cultural systems can strengthen that capacity. You can understand why someone misses the old ways. You can also understand why someone embraces the new. You're not just choosing sides. You're translating. Now let's talk about something more subtle. Belonging. If you've ever felt like you don't fully identify with Gen X cynicism or millennial optimism, you're not imagining it. Generational identity functions partly as a social mirror. It tells you who you're supposed to be. But when you fall in between categories, you often develop a slightly more individualized identity. You don't lean as heavily on generational stereotypes because they never fully fit. That can create a kind of quiet independence of thought. You're less likely to adopt sweeping narratives about your cohort because you've always known they're incomplete. And that skepticism can extend into other domains. News cycles, cultural panics, trend waves. You've seen enough transitions to know that today's certainty often becomes tomorrow's footnote. That perspective can be grounding. It can also feel isolating at times, because it means you don't always feel fully represented. But psychologically, it fosters autonomy. And autonomy, when combined with adaptability, creates resilience. So the Xennial story in adulthood isn't about confusion or dilution. It's about synthesis. You are the connective tissue between eras. You understand the emotional logic of both. Next, we'll explore what this means as Xennials move deeper into midlife. How this hybrid wiring shapes meaning, legacy, and the quiet psychological shift from adapting to choosing. And now we arrive at the part of the story that feels quieter, but maybe more powerful than anything that came before. Midlife. Not the dramatic, movie-style crisis version. Not the sports car or sudden reinvention cliché. I mean the psychological shift that happens slowly, almost invisibly, when the brain begins asking a different set of questions. If your 20s were about adapting and your 30s were about stabilizing, your 40s and beyond often become about selecting. Not everything deserves your energy anymore. Not every opportunity is compelling. Not every upgrade is necessary. And for Xennials, this stage carries a very particular flavor. Because you've spent most of your life responding to acceleration. New technology. New economic structures. New social norms. You learned how to pivot before pivoting became a buzzword. You built competence by staying flexible. But midlife, psychologically, is less about flexibility and more about integration. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson described this stage as the tension between generativity and stagnation. Generativity isn't about grand gestures. It's about contributing something that outlasts your own immediate needs. Mentoring someone. Building something steady. Creating stability for others. For Xennials, that often shows up in understated ways. You don't necessarily broadcast your contributions. You just do them. You pass along knowledge because it's useful. You fix systems because they're inefficient. You guide younger colleagues not with speeches, but with practical insight. There's a satisfaction in usefulness that runs deep here. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as mastery orientation. The reward doesn't come from applause. It comes from competence, from knowing you can handle things. And because you've navigated so many transitions already, your sense of competence isn't fragile. It's earned. But here's the subtle shift that often surprises Xennials in midlife. After years of adapting to external change, there's a growing desire to shape internal change instead. Earlier in life, you reacted. You adjusted to whatever the world required. Now the question becomes more deliberate. What do I actually want? Not what's trending. Not what's expected. Not what will impress anyone. What fits? And this is where your hybrid wiring becomes an advantage again. You remember a world that moved slower. You also know how to operate in one that moves fast. So you're uniquely equipped to design a rhythm that feels sustainable. Many Xennials begin making changes that look subtle from the outside, but feel significant internally. Shifting careers not for status, but for alignment. Scaling back certain commitments to protect energy. Deepening a handful of relationships rather than expanding networks. It's not withdrawal. It's refinement. Socio-emotional selectivity theory suggests that as people become more aware of time's finiteness, they prioritize emotionally meaningful experiences over novelty. And because Xennials have already lived through so much structural change, this prioritization often feels practical rather than sentimental. You've seen enough to know that energy is finite, so you invest it carefully. There's also a reckoning with identity happening here. Remember how your self-concept formed before digital validation systems dominated? That becomes increasingly valuable. In a culture still obsessed with visibility and optimization, Xennials often rediscover the comfort of internal metrics. Does this feel right? Does this matter to me? Am I building something durable? Not everything needs an audience. That perspective can feel almost rebellious now, but it's also psychologically grounding. Another layer to this midlife stage is how Xennials reinterpret resilience. You grew up valuing independence. You learned not to need too much. You handled transitions quietly. But maturity sometimes brings a redefinition of strength. Strength isn't only about self-sufficiency. It's also about discernment, about knowing when to ask for collaboration, when to rest, when to soften. And here's the fascinating part. Because your generation already adapted so many times externally, you often have more internal flexibility than you realize. Psychologists call this psychological flexibility, the ability to revise old strategies when they're no longer serving you. It's one of the strongest predictors of long-term well-being. You've done it with technology, with careers, with cultural norms. Now you can do it with yourself. That might mean reevaluating old beliefs about productivity, or questioning whether constant competence needs to define you, or allowing vulnerability where once you only showed steadiness. It doesn't require a dramatic reinvention, just small recalibrations. And perhaps that's the most overlooked part of the Xennial psychology. You don't usually reinvent loudly. You iterate. Quiet upgrades. Internal updates. Version changes no one else necessarily notices. But they matter. You also occupy a fascinating cultural position right now. You're old enough to remember pre-digital childhood. young enough to remain fluent in emerging systems, experienced enough to see cycles repeating, flexible enough to keep learning. In many ways, you are translators between generations. You can explain to older cohorts why the new systems matter. You can explain to younger ones how the old systems shaped us. You understand the emotional logic of both. That bridging role can feel invisible at times, but psychologically it's powerful. It fosters integrative thinking, empathy across perspectives, and tolerance for nuance. And in a world increasingly polarized by extremes, nuance is a rare skill. So what does all of this mean for you personally? It means that the tension you may have felt between analog and digital, independence and connection, stability and reinvention, was never confusion. It was context. You weren't inconsistent. You were evolving in real time. The skepticism? Adaptive realism. The adaptability? Learned survival. The occasional fatigue with constant change? A nervous system that remembers slower rhythms. When you see those patterns clearly, something shifts. Instead of wondering why you don't fully resonate with one generational label or another, you recognize the uniqueness of your wiring. Instead of seeing your caution as hesitation, you see it as calibration. Instead of feeling behind when you opt out of certain trends, you see it as discernment. And that awareness is freeing. Because once you understand how your environment shaped you, you gain choice. You can decide which traits still serve you and which ones you're ready to soften. You can keep the resilience without clinging to over-independence. You can embrace technology without surrendering to it. You can prioritize depth without feeling outdated. Your brain was built in transition. That doesn't make you fragmented. It makes you adaptive. So if this story feels familiar, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Are you still adapting? Are you refining? Are you finally choosing more deliberately? Whatever stage you're in, remember this. You were shaped at a cultural crossroads. And crossroads don't weaken identity. They strengthen navigation skills. If this resonates with you, I'd love to hear what part of the Xennial experience feels most true in your own life. And if you're curious about how other generational experiences shaped different psychological patterns, stay with me. There's always another layer to unpack. The human mind doesn't just reflect history. It carries it. And when we understand the story behind our wiring, we stop feeling out of place and start recognizing just how uniquely equipped we've been all along.